Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. Would you please welcome Tom Woods?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Very happy to be here and very happy to be getting out before the G20 gets rolling. I'm sorry you people have to go through this. What a scam. Oh, it'll be great for the city. Yeah. And why don't you try having the Olympics, too? I hear that's just great, too. Yeah, no debt results from that. All right, well, in any event, at least I get to have a Primanti Brothers sandwich tomorrow, which I've been looking forward to. Ever since I saw that thing on the Travel Channel, my goals in life widened just a bit. I said to my wife, well, one of the reasons I'm still alive is to eat that sandwich. So that's going to be great. This, by the way, this is my most recent book. It's called Meltdown. It's got a foreword by Ron Paul. It spent 10 weeks. Thank you very much. It spent 10 weeks as a New York Times bestseller earlier this year, trying to explain why it is that the free market is not to blame for this, and that the drones on CNBC are all wrong when they tell you otherwise. And I'm sure you'll be shocked to learn that the New York Times elected not to review the book. Interesting. Well, I take that as a compliment. If the book actually, really stinks, I would think they would want to just savage it, so instead they just say nothing whatsoever. I have a few copies of this, and another one of my titles, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, still kicking around. So after this, I'll be sitting out there, and I hope I can unload them, so I'll have a lighter suitcase, so I can, bring a few sandwiches home. I don't know. Anyway, it'd be nice to also get to meet some of you folks. I think the importance of this event is that it emphasizes that you don't have to be a socialist to be concerned about the G20. This is one of these phony choices we're given in the media. We look on TV, and who are the people protesting the G20? Well, kind of oddball-looking people, left-wing socialists, that sort of thing. And so you get the impression that your two choices are you can be a socialist or you can support the G20. Well, you know what they say, if they get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about your answers. And that is the wrong question. Which people should I support? The socialists or the G20? Oh boy. So we're here to suggest that, there is a third alternative. You don't have to be either one. Now, we're being told all the time that the financial crisis occurred because of animal spirits or greed and all these phony baloney psychological explanations, but nobody ever bothers to ask, well, how come greed seems to appear only in sudden cyclical clusters? Like, why wouldn't it just be occurring all the time? Why wouldn't we always be in a depression, right? Was greed invented around the year 2002 or so? I mean, what kind of non-explanation, blockhead explanation is this? And this is what we're being expected to believe. Now, what I want to do tonight is suggest for you, at least give some food for thought about some of the, or at least one major precipitating factor behind the collapse that we're living through. And no, I don't believe in the green shoots. I believe in brown manure, unfortunately. But I want to suggest what exactly may have been the most important precipitating factor, and then contrast this with the explicit and sometimes implicit view of the G20 as to what caused it. Now, right now we're going through the usual stages. Stage one is when the conventional wisdom, people on cable news channels, political leaders, all tell us that no one could have predicted this crisis. That's the stage one, right? No one could have predicted it. This just was a bolt out of the blue, just fell from the sky. And no one could have predicted it. Now, of course, we all know there were people who did predict it, and by and large it was free market economists who predicted it, so obviously this can't be the fault of the free market if it's the free market economists who were warning them. So we know Peter Schiff warned about it, we know Ron Paul warned about it, Jim Rogers warned about it, Jim Grant warned about it, but these people have been erased. They've gone down the Orwellian memory hole. They don't exist because remember what we said, no one could have predicted this. So therefore, there can't be these people. The second stage is then to portray governments and central banks as the wise stabilizers who will put the pieces back together for us, for the stupid rubes. They'll do this for us. Third stage is then to propose that what we really need is additional centralization of power and decision-making, either in the hands of the Fed or the federal government, or even some larger supranational bureaucratic structures. And that, of course, is the role of the G20, to push those things. These crises become pretexts for expanding government power. It happens every single time, no matter what the crisis is. It's always our fault, and to protect us from ourselves, the government just reluctantly needs to expand. I mean, kicking and screaming, they hate this. You know, they just hate getting more power and wealth and influence. They hate every minute of it. But just for our good, they're going to expand. And, of course, everything needs to be done very quickly, citizen. There is no time for debate. We don't have time to debate the stimulus. It's much too urgent to debate it. We don't have time to read it, flip through it, hold on to it, type it up. We don't have time. Much too urgent. And this goes back in the 1930s and the New Deal. There were bills, banking bills that were going through that Congress hadn't read. And there were even congressmen, I quote one of them in another one of my books called Who Killed the Constitution, who actually boasted that he hadn't read it. He said, you know what, I haven't read it, and I admit that, but that just shows my trust in the president. Well, so much for Thomas Jefferson, who said, let us hear no more of confidence in man, but bind him down by the chains of the Constitution. So much for that school. So everything's got to be done quickly. The stimulus, the cap and trade, we don't have time for debate. And in some cases, for example with the Federal Reserve, it also needs to be done by and large out of public view. And when the general public begins asking questions like, who's getting a lot of this money, the trillions of dollars you're handing out? What kind of collateral are you accepting? And what was the basis for your decisions? Well, the Fed's response pretty much has been to say that, we peons really, we really better stop pestering our betters with all these impertinent questions. That's pretty much been their attitude. So you can imagine how they feel about Ron Paul's bill, H.R. 1207, to audit the Federal Reserve System. There are going to be hearings to that effect this Friday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can watch them on the website of the House Financial Services Committee. You can click on just what you want first thing in the morning, a live stream of Barney Frank right into your living room. Fantastic. So, I have something I want to tell you about that I can't tell you, so I'll postpone it for later. But the point is that that's awesome. Right? There's just no getting around it. This is so wonderful. Because it's fantastic to see somebody as normally smug as Ben Bernanke have a look of sheer terror on his face. And it sort of reminds me of what the government always tells us. Every time we uncover another surveillance program that the federal government has been secretly undertaking against us, the federal government's response is always, well, hey, look, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. Well, that goes for you too, Ben Bernanke. You ain't been doing anything wrong. What's to worry about, right? The audit will be a breeze. I think they've been doing some things wrong. There's no other way to account for the sheer panic. But that's another matter. That's another matter. We can sit and gloat over drinks later about Ben Bernanke's predicament because he's in a lose-lose situation. After all, if the audit goes through, that's bad. And if the audit doesn't go through, that's just as bad. Because then more and more Americans would begin asking, well, wait a minute. I mean, this seems like a common sense thing, right? I mean, here's the institution that has the government-granted monopoly privilege of being able to create legal tender money out of thin air, and it doesn't want a full audit. That just seems a little bit fishy. So no matter what happens, he's in big trouble, and I think that's a good thing. And it's a good thing in particular because no one expected this. Like 2 years ago, no one expected that people would wake up to the point that something like this would have this much political success. Nobody expected anything like this. We're supposed to sit there and just let our wise overlords apply their scientific management of the money supply and smooth out the business cycle and all the propaganda. But people aren't falling for it anymore, and that's good. I gotta watch my P's here. This is a very hot mic. All right. Now, there is a natural tendency built into our system toward a structure like a world central bank issuing a world currency. Now, I'm not saying that such a thing is right around the corner, but there is a natural tendency toward it. And there are critics of the G20 who are arguing that it's not going far enough, that it really should be pushing explicitly right now for a global central bank. I mean, The process basically runs like this. And forgive me, those of you who are Austrian economists out here who already know this, forgive me, but the process goes like this. Society starts off without any money. Society starts off engaged in barter. I give you a Frisbee, you give me 3 scrambled eggs. And eventually people realize this is an awkward sort of system because not every person who can supply 3 scrambled eggs wants a Frisbee in return. And likewise, if all you have, let's say, is a giant castle, and all you'd like to do is buy the daily paper, how are you going to do that? So it occurs to people, just by using their reason, that it would be better if we all adopted a highly marketable good that we will all accept in exchange for other goods. And then it becomes easier to facilitate our transactions. And whatever that highly marketable good is, becomes the money. And we've seen in prisoner of war camps, it's cigarettes that are spontaneously adopted as a medium of exchange. And not because everybody in a prisoner of war camp smokes, but because the cigarettes become valued for what they can accomplish in exchange. Because you know other people might smoke, other people might value the cigarettes. So in other words, you don't have to posit the idea that governments introduce money into society, because it is sufficient to understand that human beings recognize through the use of reason that the introduction of money voluntarily on a society-wide basis will make their transactions easier. In fact, if governments were to try to introduce some artificial good that people had not spontaneously accepted as money, it wouldn't work. Number one, it wouldn't work because let's suppose this is the first time money's ever been introduced. Who's going to accept it who has never actually experienced money before? Who would ever accept this? Who would ever accept the idea that, yeah, these totally useless, worthless stones, you should just accept them because I promise you other people will take them? You'd say, what? What are you talking about? Forget you, I gotta go get my scrambled eggs from the Frisbee wanting guy. Get out of my way. But secondly, if the government just simply one day said, okay, we're gonna draw number 5 on this piece of paper and say, here's $5, go use it. The reason we couldn't use it is we have no idea what it was worth. We have no idea, man, just a piece of paper, we have no idea how to assess its value. Whereas gold or silver or cigarettes that come into existence as money spontaneously bring with them an array of prices in terms of barter. So in other words, as gold, for example, began to be used as money, people began to realize, okay, let's see, it takes this much gold to get a hat, and this much to get a pair of pants, and this much to get a book. And once the gold comes into existence and fully begins to circulate as a medium of exchange, it carries with it this array of prices that it had been building up during the barter days. But a paper money that's just introduced out of nowhere doesn't bring with it this array of prices, so no one would know how to use it. So this is why money has to occur spontaneously outside of government. It can't just be imposed on the people. I mean, I suppose you could impose it on the people if you assigned a death penalty to everybody if they didn't use it. I suppose people could then play Monopoly money with it or something, but basically it can't be done. So how then does government get us to the system we have now? And governments all around the world have done this, where we're just using pieces of paper that aren't worth anything. How did that ever get going? As we've seen, they couldn't have started that way. So how did it happen? Well, first you have gold or silver, and sometimes you've got both of them, and they need to fluctuate freely against each other. And then what will happen is we get this innovation whereby you can use paper instead of the gold or silver, but don't worry, the paper is immediately redeemable into the precious metal. Now, there's nothing in theory wrong with that. That's fine. It's a more convenient money substitute sometimes than the precious metal. But once you start using paper instead of having direct contact with the metal, you then become accustomed to thinking of the money as being the paper. And so the first link is broken. Psychologically, we think of money as being the paper. Then the next step is that the government removes the gold or silver backing from the paper so that no longer can you exchange the paper for a precious metal. And we saw that in 1933 in the United States and then completed in 1971. They actually just took the gold. They just took it from people. And I think at the time, people didn't realize this was permanent. They thought this was an emergency measure, and I know that our wise overlords in Washington know what they're doing, so I'll hand them my gold and I'll wait for them to give it back to me. And in the meantime, they're going to give me these pieces of paper, which I've always been able to exchange for gold in the past, so everything seems on the up and up. And then they found out you're not getting it back, so that's the next stage. And by the way, when people ask me, do I think they're going to confiscate gold again? Well, they might. Gold isn't in nearly as widespread use now as it was then, so they may not. But if they did, now that we know how the story turns out, that they don't actually end up giving it back to you, what I think people are likely to do is what they'd be likely to do if the government decided to confiscate all handguns. Well, you know, just to keep the government out of your business, you might go to your door and you'll get that one gun that's the most annoying to maintain and clean and keep ready, and you hand that and say, "Here you go, sir. Thank you for keeping me safe by disarming me." And you close the door. And meanwhile, you still got your big stash in the back. Well, I think the same thing would happen if they try to take the gold, right? You give them some crummy, you know, clipped coin or something, and then like you got your gold bullion vault, you know, in your basement. That's another matter. That's a matter of personal advice, what to do in that situation. But, so they take away the backing, and then you're left with the paper. So they don't start with the paper. But once you're left with it, the idea is that now the paper has an array of prices attached to it from the time that it was redeemable into gold. So the paper is usable. And now it's also started circulating out of habit for all these years. So now you can get the fiat paper circulating. But now governments have this other problem. There are multiples of paper currencies in the world. It's not just the US dollar. There are many other currencies. And so the US government would love to be able to multiply the supply of dollars so that it can reward its favorite constituencies with all this cash. But you've got to keep a limit on that, or otherwise other currencies will appreciate against yours and people may flee into other currencies. So now there becomes an interest in limiting the number of currencies so that people have fewer options. People have a lessened ability to flee from your own crummy currency, the fewer there are to flee into. And so when you see things like the euro being introduced, that's how you should understand them. Not as a wonderful move forward, but instead as a shrinking of the supply of these fiat paper monies, which are all crummy. But at least if you're going to have them, we'd like to have more than fewer, so as to give people more options, so they don't get stuck when their own currency goes down the tubes. So this is why there's a natural progression in government's interests to move toward a single world currency, because then you're stuck. Then you can't flee anywhere. It's for the same reason that many government officials in the United States don't like the fact that certain American states have different tax and regulatory structures from other states, because people will flee from the high tax to the low tax states. The high tax states don't like that. And what they'd like to do is equalize all the taxes across all the states. So again, you have nowhere to go, nowhere to flee. It's like a giant prison, basically, is the model for all this. And nowhere to flee, not into another currency, not another location. We gotcha. So this is logical. It's not difficult to understand. You can see the logical progression here. Now, as I say, the G20 is not expressly calling for this, but it follows absolutely logically from the whole G20 agenda. Now, let me describe for you what I consider to be the precipitating factor behind what it is we're living through right now. And it's not greed, it's not animal spirits, it's not any of that stuff. It's the Federal Reserve. Now, I know you knew that. So that really wasn't that dramatic a gulp of water I just took. I knew you knew I was going to blame the Federal Reserve. I mean, we could talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and things like that, but I think that's small potatoes compared to the Federal Reserve. The damage they did couldn't have really been done if there hadn't been the Federal Reserve. Now, most Americans hear Federal Reserve and they think, this is some crazily complicated thing that I could never possibly understand, so I'm just going to change the channel and forget about it. No. That's how we got into this mess. The more Americans know that we're being ruled by charlatans, the better. And the way you can know that is by learning this stuff. And it's not that hard. There is this, I think, attempt to make it seem as if the economics of all this is just so complicated that we could never understand it. And again, we just have to entrust, Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke or whoever the wise man happens to be. We have to entrust them with these responsibilities. Again, that's a mistake. And so what I want to do is spend just a few minutes, and again, I hope the Austrians will allow me this brief digression, but I want to explain something called, and don't leave, don't you leave, you just sit there. I want to explain something called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Now sit down, this is not as bad as it sounds. The Austrian School of Economics is the oldest continuously existing school of economics in the world. It is also right now the smallest, but at the same time it's the fastest growing, because the Austrians have been consistent in predicting this crisis. In the 1990s, when everyone said, oh, it's a new era of permanent prosperity, the Austrians said, oh, yeah, right. And then indeed, we got the dot-com collapse. In fact, even Alan Greenspan was saying, yeah, we've reached a new era in which booms don't have to be followed by busts. Interesting little statement there, Alan. And then in the 1920s, we had people literally saying, this is a new era of prosperity, and we're never going to have the business cycle again. We're never going to have ups and downs. Why? Because we have wise scientific management of the money supply by the Federal Reserve System. Citizen, haven't you seen this? It's wonderful. And Irving Fisher, who is considered to be the founding father of modern mainstream economics, told people in September 1929, stocks have reached a permanently high plateau. Well, he lost a fortune in the stock market, not surprisingly. But who was saying, now wait a minute, forget all these crazy fantasies about how your wizards at the Federal Reserve are going to banish the business cycle and tornadoes and whatever, and cuts on your knee forever. Let's forget all these fantasies. The bust is coming. That's what F.A. Hayek said. And that's what Ludwig von Mises said in 1928, 1929. So that's what, and these people belong to something called the Austrian School of Economics. It's a school of thought. Now, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974, and you may say, well, I don't care. A lot of crummy people have won the Nobel Prize in economics, and that's true. And I don't want to mention any names, Paul Krugman, but there is a recent winner of the Nobel Prize. You think, well, gee, if this guy wins it, how much could this prize be worth? And to an extent, you're right. But the difference is, Krugman wins it for telling the powers that be exactly what they want to hear. Hayek wins it for saying the exact opposite of what they want to hear. Hayek wins it for saying, you know what? Maybe economic instability is caused by the central banks. Maybe the central banks are not our wise saviors after all. Maybe they destabilize rather than stabilize. You think that's what the Nobel Committee wants to hear? And yet he wins it. So that is significant. That is significant. He wins it without being a bootlegger. That's significant. Now, as for Ludwig von Mises, they were contemporaries. I'm wearing here the necktie that we sell at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. It's got the coat of arms of the Mises family. And one of the quadrants shows the Bible opened up to the Ten Commandments. It happened to be Mises' view that governments needed to learn a little something about that thou shalt not steal matter. So here we have the Mises coat of arms. And now Mises, just a little thing about him. Ludwig von Mises, M-I-S-E-S. If you don't know his name, then go Google him and learn about it. Because we need to know this guy. Ludwig von Mises, not only was he a pioneer, I mean, he deserved to win the Nobel Prize probably 12 times over for all the different contributions he made to the field. In 1920, he wrote an article explaining why pure socialism was impossible. People said, oh gosh, what a 19th century Neanderthal this guy is. Interesting. Well, Mises goes through his life teaching. In the 1930s, he's teaching in Switzerland. And then the Nazis grow in influence. And by 1940, in the face of Nazi-occupied Europe, Mises has to flee. Partly because he's Jewish, and partly because he's not exactly teaching what the autarkic National Socialist Party wants to hear. He's teaching about the international division of labor and cooperation that's brought about by the free market. Well, that's not exactly Hitler's economic philosophy. So Mises had his library and papers in Vienna confiscated, and only decades later were these things found. He and his wife had to flee to the United States, empty-handed, at the age of about 58 or 59. He arrives in 1940 in New York, not speaking a word of English. Not one American university will offer him a paid university post, even though he's arguably the greatest economist of all time. No one will offer him. Instead, he takes a position at New York University as an unpaid professor, and his salary for several decades after that was paid by a consortium of businessmen who were intelligent enough to appreciate what Mises was doing. And the other professors at NYU thought he was a quaint old relic of the 19th century. He's a foolish little man who talks about free markets. And yet those people who got the prestigious chairs and the professorships over Mises are long since forgotten, have fallen into obscurity. Nobody reads or studies them anymore. Whereas Mises has inspired the founding of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, where I'm privileged to be a senior fellow, where we help to promote his work, which, if correctly applied, anticipates this current crisis. And we educate young people who are not interested in John Maynard Keynes, but they're interested in this man who gave his life for an idea, who sacrificed institutional prestige for an idea in the face of seemingly impossible odds. And yet, in the several decades since his death, there has been a renaissance in the thought of Mises. This is why we should listen to these folks. And what they're saying in the Austrian theory of the business cycle is really, I'm going to give a really stripped down version. Pretty much runs like this. And I promise you, anyone in this room can understand this. The only people who have trouble understanding this are other Nobel Prize winners. But actual human beings have no problem. Okay, it runs like this. If interest rates go lower, businessmen tend to invest more. I mean, that's, you don't need to be a brain surgeon, right? I mean, if interest rates are lower, it's cheaper to finance your projects. Simple. And in fact, the longer term your project is, the more it'll be stimulated by low interest rates. Because as you know, when you borrow money, the longer you borrow it, the more the interest multiplies. So when the interest rate comes down, well, then it becomes all the easier to invest in longer term projects. Projects that aren't going to bear fruit for a long time. So for example, research and development. I mean, you might not get a product out of that for 20 years. Or investing in new mining capacity or raw materials. That's very, very far from producing a toaster or a consumer good. So we call these higher order goods. They're way away from the consumer. Research and development, I don't buy research and development services as a consumer. I don't buy mining services as a consumer. These are high order goods, and they take a long time to be brought to fruition. And so they, and manufacturing and construction, they tend to get particular stimulus when interest rates are low. But what the Austrian theory of the business cycle is saying is that's a good thing that businesses invest when interest rates are low. Because what does it mean when interest rates are low? How did they get low? Let's leave the Federal Reserve out for a minute. How did the interest rate get low? It got low because you and I saved. And the more we save, the more the banks have to lend, and so borrowing becomes cheaper. And when you and I save, we're doing two things. Number one, we're indicating that we're not going to run out and blow our whole paycheck. We're going to save some of our consumption for the future. That's good because businesses are engaged in long-term production for the future. So there's a match up there. But secondly, when we save and we're not consuming every single dollar we earn, businesses that cater to the consumer will start to shrink. And when they shrink, they're going to release resources they don't need anymore. Some employees, some trucking services, some steel. And now these resources are available for use up in the higher order stages, in these long-term investments. So again, there's a coordination process that the interest rate brings about. But now, dun dun dun, the Federal Reserve comes in. And the Federal Reserve says, let's force interest rates down, right? I mean, isn't that the key to prosperity? Let's just force them down. Well, here's the difference. In this case, if the Fed just forces them down, yeah, they are low. And yes, businesses will look and say, hey, now's the time to invest in those long-term projects, except notice the difference. In this case, the public is not, in fact, deferring consumption for the future. In this case, the public is still spending the way it always has. So the public is demanding more of existing goods now at a time when businesses are being misled by low interest rates into engaging in long-term product development. So there's a time mismatch. But secondly, in this case, again, consumers haven't changed their behavior. The reason interest rates are low is because the central bank has forced them down, forced interest rates down. And so if we haven't restricted our consumption, then businesses that cater to consumers aren't contracting. They aren't releasing employees or trucking services or steel for use in these higher order stages. So you've got businesses starting up in these higher order stages thinking there are going to be resources available for them, but they're not there. And so they wind up in a tug of war between businesses down here close to the consumer and businesses up here far away. They wind up in a tug of war. Instead of a harmonious coordination, there's a tug of war. Mises gives a great analogy. He says, imagine the economy as being like a master builder building a house. But the master builder is under the false impression that he has 20% more bricks than he actually has. Now, is it better for him to discover this error sooner or later? Well, obviously, the sooner he discovers it, the less waste. If he discovers it after laying the first row of bricks, great. He only wastes that one row. And then he can carry on and maybe redesign the house or go do something else. But if he discovers it when he's laying the last brick, that's terrible. He's squandered all these resources, all this labor time, that's bad. Well, that's what's going on when the central bank tries to force interest rates lower than the market will set them. You get the whole economy, as it were, acting like this master builder, trying to start more projects than there are physical resources to complete them. And it is not wise to say, well, The thing to do to solve this problem is to force interest rates even lower. Because that would be like saying to the master builder, I know you're running low on bricks, and you probably won't be able to finish this house, so what you should do is go get drunk, so that you don't even think about this problem anymore. So you'll just keep on building. Well, does that happen? I mean, if he gets drunk, does that suddenly make the project completable? No. It just means he's going to perpetuate a stupid, unfinishable project. Well, that's exactly what we're doing every time we say, we need interest rates down to zero to fix this economy. We need interest rates even lower than zero. Well, all you're doing there is basically telling the economy, just get drunk. Ignore the fact that you're on an unsustainable trajectory. Ignore the fact that you're doing things that make no sense and can't be finished. Keep on doing it. And that's what our economists tell us. We need monetary stimulus. We need the Fed to create a lot of money and credit. That's what we're being told. Now, in fact, we've just lived through an example of what I've just described in that master builder case, because in the 2000-2001 recession, when the dot-com bust, the NASDAQ bubble burst, that was the first recession on record in which housing starts did not decline. Because in that recession, Greenspan, the Fed chairman at the time, said, you know what, I'm sick of being in a downturn. To quote Homer Simpson, it's time to laugh again. And so in 2001, Greenspan lowered rates 11 times. And remember, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. He's got the lower the interest rate hammer. So, okay, I see there's no problem that can't be solved by lowering interest rates. So he did that in 2001, and we got a relatively mild recession. And people said, hey, isn't that super? This guy's the maestro. The New York Times said he's the infallible maestro of our financial system. This is amazing. He avoided a recession. Well, here's what he actually did. People drew the false conclusion because he refused to let the recession run its course. He refused to let the economy say, wait a minute, we're doing the wrong thing. We got to regroup, we got to retool, we got to start over, we got to do different things. He didn't let that happen. He didn't let the economy sort itself out. So instead, people drew the conclusion that, hey, wow, apparently housing is robust even in a recession. So apparently housing prices never go down. The best investment I can make is to buy a house. I can flip houses and make extra money that way. They draw these conclusions because Greenspan won't let the economy fix itself. So we're continuing. He's in effect telling us to get drunk. Keep doing what you're doing. So that when the bust inevitably comes, as it will inevitably come, after all this creation of money and credit out of thin air, as it will inevitably come, it's all the worse. Because all these years we've been continuing on this unsustainable trajectory, just as if we got our master builder from our analogy drunk and encouraged him to continue doing all these unsustainable things. Now that's a very brief overview. But notice that this has nothing to do with the free market. This is an intervention into the free market. But yet they'll blame the free market because central banking is never mentioned, is not to be mentioned except to be praised. Except as our wise overlords who see us through these tough times. You're never allowed to criticize it. That is just off the table. Forget it. And yet, let's look at the G20. Look at their agenda. Look at the comments leading up to the meeting. I put a funny satirical post on LouRockwell.com's blog recently as an ad for this event, and I said, according to news reports, the G20 countries are going to discuss this week how central banks and their artificially low interest rates and their flooding of the economy with artificial money and credit contributed to the financial collapse. And then I said, oh, wait a minute, I made that up. Of course, we're not going to talk about that. No, not a word. Not one word about central banks. Again, except the central banks are wonderful and they'll help us out. No, they want to talk about, the French want to talk about bank salaries and bonuses. Because that's super urgent, right? I mean, that's clearly the heart of the thing, right? Bank salaries and bonuses, right? Now, it's true that you do hear some people saying we need more regulations and we need international regulation. You do hear some G20 people talking about that. We need higher capital requirements. That is to say, we don't want the banks and our financial institutions to be operating on such a small sliver of equity. We don't want them to be so heavily based on a model of debt. But we already had capital requirements, right? I mean, the Europeans had the Basel Accords. The United States had capital requirements. The thing is, firms find ways around them, number one. Number two, the capital requirements here were part of the problem. Because they told banks that if you're holding mortgage-backed securities, well, we all know mortgage-backed securities, like, if you've got Fannie and Freddie and loans of that sort, that well, these are all super reliable loans. You know, they're all going to be paid back and everything. So if you're holding these, then you can lend out even more than if you weren't holding them, or if you were holding other kinds of assets. So the banks held on to the mortgage-backed securities. A lot of institutions held on to them. The whole point of mortgage-backed securities is for the banks not to hold on to them, is to distribute them out in the world so as to dissipate the risk, not concentrate them. So it's their own dumb regulation in the first place that causes some of the problem. But the real question that they should ask, but of course they never will, is why is it that in the financial sector, equity ratios are so low? That is to say, why are they so indebted? Why are they borrowing so much? How come we don't have a problem why do we not need to impose capital requirements in the shoe industry, or the shellfish industry, or the hat industry, where they've got capital and equity ratios of 50 to 60%? How come it's 2 to 3% in the financial world? I mean, do they even bother asking? Is this just a spontaneous product of the free market? Well, no. It's because the financial world knows it's got the big old sugar daddy, the Federal Reserve System, that can bail it out with fresh money anytime they need it. So why should they? Why should they have a lot of capital on hand? So, in other words, the system contributes to this problem. But we cannot question the system, citizen. The system is sound. And yet, even the International Monetary Fund admits this. And when the International Monetary Fund admits something, it must be screamingly obvious. They said in April 2008 that financial firms have become more complacent about their liquidity risk management systems and underinsured against an adverse liquidity event, depending more heavily on central bank intervention for their liquidity problems. So that's a fancy way of saying that the reason these firms are all so vulnerable is that they're all sitting back because they know that the Ben Bernanke's of the world will come bail them out. They won't bail out you and me, not that I would want their crummy bailouts, but they'll always bail out the well-connected, the financial sector. They don't have to worry about anything, and they don't. So it's built into the system. Again, that's got nothing to do with the free market. A monopoly institution given government privileges to print up legal tender money out of thin air, bailing out market actors, and that's capitalism's fault? You've got to be kidding me. So if institutional factors are going to make people more risk-prone because they know that if things go sour, the old sugar daddy will come bail them out, you can have all the regulation you want, because you're not getting to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is moral hazard, a term that's thrown around a lot. Moral hazard simply refers to people's willingness to act with an elevated level of risk tolerance because they know that if they make big profits, they get to keep them. And if they make big losses, don't worry, the losses will be shared by all the suckers, by all the peons in the country. Don't worry about that. And so that's the problem. And the very existence of the Federal Reserve exacerbates and institutionalizes this problem because every market actor knows that given that all the Fed has to do is print up money or just push a few keystrokes and create all the money and credit it wants, since they know that under a fiat paper system, that's where the money is not redeemable into anything, that there is no physical constraint on how much money can be created, well, again, they're going to rely on the money creation machine to come bail them out. This cannot be a surprise. And so, you're going to have to get rid of this monetary system and replace it with a sound one if you really want to do away with moral hazard. Sure, you could try to regulate this sector, and then that sector, and then that sector, and then that sector, and then that sector. And you could, I suppose, get some type of order in the economy. But you know where else you see a lot of order? In a morgue. There's a lot of order in a morgue. There's a lot of order in a cemetery. That's the type of order you'll get. So if you try, as my friend Guido Hulsmann puts it, he's the chairman of the economics department at the University of Angers in France, he says, if you try to eliminate moral hazard through micro-regulation of this and this and this and this, all you're going to do is suffocate the economy, and you're going to prove that if you try to eliminate moral hazard without going after the source, which is the paper money central bank system, then the only way to do that, the only way to go after these problems without going to the source is to subject the economy to a Soviet-style central plan. There's no alternative. Now let's look at the other problems we've got here. Again, we need capital requirements. We need a systemic regulator at the global level, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's look at what the regulators have done to us up to now. We've got all these firms that we're told are too big to fail. So what have they done? They've made them bigger. They're bigger now. So what happens next time? Well, next time, President Obama says, now look, this is the last time we're doing this. We're not going to bail anybody out after this. This is it. That's pretty plausible. That's pretty believable, right? So now we've got even bigger institutions, thanks to government-enforced mergers and so on and so forth. So the too big to fails are now even bigger, and we have governments to thank for that. How about the fact that in 1998, Alan Greenspan bailed out an institution called long-term capital management. Instead of letting them go under, he bailed them out. Now, suppose he hadn't bailed them out. If he hadn't bailed them out, you better believe these other firms that have gone under would have immediately gotten their houses in order, knowing that, wait a minute, if you fail, you're going to fail. But instead, they knew that this meant, hey, the sugar daddy is alive and well, baby. Just carry on as if nothing's wrong. In fact, this became known among investors as the Greenspan put. The idea that good old Alan is not going to allow asset prices to fall beneath a certain level. He's going to come to the rescue no matter what happens. What type of entrepreneur does that encourage? The type we want? Or crazy, risk-prone drunkards, basically? I mean, the question answers itself. In fact, by bailing out these firms in the first place, what our wise overlords have done is pretty much told firms that kept their powder dry during the boom. Firms that said, look, there's something fishy about this whole mortgage-backed security market. We're gonna steer clear of this, and when it inevitably busts, then we're gonna run in, we'll get our market share, we'll get our reward. Well, they're not letting that happen. They're rewarding the people who were in the middle of it. So basically what they're saying is, if you stay risk-averse during a boom, during a bubble, you're just a chump. You're just a chump. Because the crazy people will get bailed out. Well, what type of long-term effect do you think that has? Think anybody at the G20 is talking about that? No. Needless to say, just the opposite. In fact, there's an article that appeared several years ago in something called the Journal of Financial Economics. And the article was interested in looking at to what degree does so-called systemic risk exist. Systemic risk is this idea that if you've got, a big firm, a financial firm, and it goes under, then another firm will go under, and then it'll be a big domino effect, and then we'll all be reduced to crawling around eating worms. That was the idea. That's where too big to fail comes from. Well, this article in the Journal of Financial Economics went and tried to quantify systemic risk. And the figure they came up with as to how much really does systemic risk exist and how big of a problem is it, the answer they came up with was about zero, actually. It's about zero. But the system, yeah, sure, there'd be disruption, but it can be rearranged quickly. You just get new owners taking over an unchanged amount of assets. That systemic risk, in other words, is by and large a grandiose rationalization that politicians can use to justify bailing out their firms. That's what it is. It does not, in fact, have serious intellectual support. Now, the G20 is encouraging us to have a kind of superstitious trust in regulators. The implication being that, deregulation is a big problem. Well, one of what I call Woods's laws, I coined a new one recently. One of Woods's laws, I think this is law number 2 or 3, is that deregulation is always phony. It's always phony. There's hardly ever a real deregulation. So the California energy market is not real deregulation, and then when there are inevitable problems, they blame it on deregulation. The S&Ls were not really deregulated. They were allowed to do riskier things, but keep their government guarantee. That's not deregulation, but yet the S&L fiasco was blamed on deregulation. So when you hear about deregulation, it's almost always phony. But in terms of regulators per se, my friend Bob Higgs puts it this way. He says, we're being told that if only we had more regulation, more regulators, this or that, we could have solved this problem. And he says, look, what powers would we have needed to give these people to make them into the wise geniuses we're told they could have been to prevent all this? He says, let's not have this romantic view of regulators. What really are they? And Higgs says, they're really they've always been time-serving drones and co-conspirators with the established firms, the regulated firms. That's what they are. And the fact is, how many bright young business school students have you ever heard say, I'd like to grow up to be an international regulator? None, of course, is the answer. Nobody says that. So it turns out that it winds up being the slow kids who wind up as the regulators. So in other words, We're going to have a system in which the slow kids who graduate number 508 out of 512 are not going to have rings run around them by the kids who graduated number 5 and 6. How about having a system? You know what the best regulator is? The fear of loss. That's a good regulation. How about the fear that maybe the sugar daddy won't bail me out? And you know, suddenly you'd be amazed at how conservative these firms would become. But again, that is not to be considered, citizen, because, you know, Wall Street and Main Street are the same thing. You know you're being had when they give you propaganda like that. And incidentally, the regulators we had thought the system was fine. Ben Bernanke's regulators told him that the mortgage market and lending standards were sounder than ever. So we need more of these people? That's the thing. I mean, maybe it's that the system stinks. The system is full of the wrong incentives. The system is the opposite, or close to it, of the free market. How about that? Not even to be considered. Jeffrey Garten, who was an advisor under Bill Clinton, says of the G20 that they need to establish and talk about this week a global central bank that will also act as a super regulator. So again, the idea that fallible human beings who prove themselves to be fallible during this crisis, we just need like a giant fallible human being at the top. And I'm sure he'll always be right. Well, again, what about having a system where, you know, the sugar daddy doesn't help out the politically well-connected firms? I'm telling you, that would be, and in which interest rates aren't pushed to artificially low levels, which encourages bubbles and speculation. How about that? Again, not even considered. Now, what in fact, I know I've got only a few minutes until I hit my 50 that I was promised, but when we think about this, I mean, you know, what we just lived through, the housing bubble, the biggest bubble in the history of mankind. What causes these bubbles? Do they just appear? And in fact, Austin Goolsbee, there's an Ayn Randian name for you, right? I mean, Austin Goolsbee is one of Obama's advisors, says that we need to have a, you know, Obama says he's going to prick asset bubbles before they cause problems, he's just going to go prick them. He's going to detect them. Again, they've got magical powers. We're so lucky to have these people, really. But the implication is that these bubbles just sort of occur spontaneously. They have no cause. And by bubble, I mean a sector of the economy in which prices are unsustainably high, or prices don't match with fundamentals, such as in housing. There's something wrong when in San Francisco you pay $1.1 million and you get like an outhouse. Like there's clearly something wrong there. How does that happen? Well, we're supposed to believe this happens because, you know, you and I make stupid decisions, or we're psychologically caught up in buying houses. No. As Mises showed, the way these bubbles occur is because the money supply is increased like crazy. Because when you have a bubble in some sector, like housing, if I try to buy houses, and then you buy houses, and when everybody's crazily buying houses, the price of houses goes up. Well, how are people going to perpetuate this bubble? How are people going to be able to afford houses when they keep going up and up and up if they're not able to get cheap credit from somewhere? These bubbles are self-liquidating unless there's a spigot of cheap credit. And the spigot is our Soviet commissar in charge of money and interest rates, Alan Greenspan in the case of the housing bubble. That's where it came from. If you hadn't had that, let's say people just started buying a lot of houses, the banks would have started to run low on funds to lend, and so interest rates would have gone up. And that would have stopped all this crazy speculation. But the interest rates don't go up, and this signal doesn't. We don't get any red lights in the economy. They're all green because of the Fed interfering in a free market. So central banking, in other words, is the last respectable bastion of central planning in the world. We've supposedly discarded central planning, except when it comes to the very lifeblood of the economy, in which case we turn everything over to some guy. And now we're being told to turn everything over to some even more sinister guy running a world central bank. And these are the options we have. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what I hope you'll do is continue to educate yourselves on this subject. Because we in this room, you know, because we know something's wrong, we have a special moral responsibility to act on that and to spread the word to people through forwarding an article, a YouTube, a speech, a book, whatever, and get people thinking about it. That is our responsibility here. And I don't know if we're going to win or we're going to lose, but regardless of whether we're going to win or we're going to lose, we've got to be doing the same thing, which is educating people. And that starts with educating ourselves. I still consider myself a student of all this. But one thing I did, because a lot of people are interested in this stuff, and they say, how do I learn about like real economics so I can see through these stooges? I don't even know where to start. There's so many books and articles and audio files. I made a reading list I put together. Starts from very beginner, goes through intermediate, and it just goes as far as you're willing to go. And it's mostly stuff that's available for free online. It's a lot of MP3s for people who drive in your car, you don't have time to read. And if this interests you, and I've got it up at my website, tomwoods.com. Go to the articles page, a few items down at tomwoods.com, you'll see this stuff there. And there's no way on that website for you to send me money. So this is not an attempt to solicit money from you. You can look and look. There's no address. There's no PayPal link. There's no way to send me any money. But this, I hope, will help you. Secondly, I hope you will visit the Ludwig von Mises Institute website, mises.org, M-I-S-E-S.org, and go to the media page and look at the thousands of hours of free audio on every subject under the sun. Fascinating stuff you can listen to. I mean, it's at least 1,000 hours. And I mean, that's like more hours than the average Frenchman works in a year. Right? It's amazing, right at your fingertips. But I'll just close with this. H.L. Mencken said that the most dangerous man to any government is the man who is able to think things out for himself. That is the sense, ladies and gentlemen, in which we can't afford not to be dangerous. Let's learn, let's forget the propaganda and the stooges, and let's learn the truth and spread it. Thank you.
Wasn't it great? Yeah, awesome. Back for more. Here's what's going to happen, the rest of the schedule. We have a short video for you. It's from a member of Congress. That's not Ron Paul, but this member of Congress also supports what's going on here. Then we'll have a short break, roughly 10 minutes, and we're going to have to be very tight about that so that we can get to our next speaker, keep the evening moving. Now, this next one is a video, and it's a video from